What if the moment you were born wasn't random? What if that strange, trembling instant, the breath before breath, was not simply when your lungs began to fill, but when something older in you was called forward? Not a soul falling into time, but a soul entering its place. Not a name assigned, but a myth remembered. There are whispers that follow us from the beginning, though we rarely hear them. They don't shout, they don't beg. They echo beneath everything, a presence we can't name. A haunting that feels less like fear and more like longing. A feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, we've missed something essential about who we are and why we came. It starts in childhood, a vague sense that life began before we understood it, that by the time we could speak, the story was already being written not by us, but around us. The shape of our lives seemed set in motion before we were ready. School, family, culture, 1,000 invisible scripts written in the language of expectation, and we followed because there was no map back. But somewhere in that silence, something waited. Carl Jung, the wanderer of the unconscious, once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." He did not say this with bitterness. He said it like someone who had seen the other side. To Jung, the day of your birth was not simply an entry into the world. It was a symbolic intersection, a confluence of time, psyche, and collective myth. A psychic atmosphere etched with archetypal resonance. The unconscious does not work through logic. It speaks in symbol, in pattern, in rhythm. And the month you were born, he believed, carried a particular kind of psychological weather, a patterned energy, not as superstition, but as symbolic inheritance. This was not astrology, it was archetypal time. And you, wherever you were born on that wheel, entered not just the world, but a certain resonance. A tone, a myth waiting to unfold through you. Maybe you felt it. A quiet familiarity with a certain kind of role, a deep pull toward a type of struggle, a recurring theme that keeps returning in your relationships, your longing, your fears. You might think it's coincidence. You might call it personality. But what if it's neither? What if it's the echo of your own myth whispering? You were born for this. In the silence before speech. In the light before memory. In the moment you arrived. Something ancient stirred, not fate, not instruction, but invitation. And now, after all these years of walking under the weight of who you were told to be, you are finally being asked to turn back, to look at that moment not with logic but with soul, to see it not as a fact, but as a doorway. So stay with me. Let us return together to the month of your birth, not to predict, not to define, but to remember what has been silently waiting inside you all along. The whisper is still there, not behind you, but beneath you, in the ground of your being, in the womb of time, and it's calling you home. The video opens not with a proclamation, but with a wound, a quiet ache wrapped in solitude. It speaks to something ancient, something almost ceremonial, a feeling that the world, though full of people and voices, has turned away from you. The narrator doesn't offer comfort, not yet. Instead, they offer a question. What if your loneliness is not a mistake? What if it is the beginning of something sacred? The emotion is palpable. It does not cry out. It lingers. It's the kind of feeling that presses against the chest in the still hours of the night. The tone is slow, deliberate, like a voice echoing through a vast inner cathedral. The words are spoken not to entertain, but to awaken. There's a reverence here, a solemnity, as if we are being ushered into a ritual rather than a YouTube video. The story being told is not of events, but of states of being. It follows no linear arc, but moves in spirals, closer and closer to the truth hidden in the silence of being alone. We are led through the landscape of isolation, not as a place of suffering, but as a kind of interior wilderness, a spiritual geography where the self is meant to be found. Carl Jung's philosophy becomes the vessel, the sacred text behind the ceremony. He is not introduced like a scholar, but like a prophet who knew that to be cast out by the world is sometimes the soul's secret calling. The rhythm of the piece is meditative. There are no sharp turns, no abrupt tonal shifts. Instead, it flows like a stream moving through shadowed forest, steady, thoughtful, gently unsettling. Each paragraph carries the weight of a drumbeat. Each phrase allows space for silence to speak. The pacing is slow enough to allow thought, memory, and personal reflection to rise in the mind of the listener. The voice, though firm, carries the humility of one who has suffered too. It does not instruct, it invites. It does not rescue, it reveals. The storytelling is layered with imagery drawn from religious, psychological, and mythic traditions. References to Christ in the desert, Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, and Jung in the solitude of his red book are not casual. They are presented as mirrors to our own journey through separation. The listener is not merely absorbing information, they are being initiated. As the video deepens, it reveals that solitude is not punishment, but passage. Loneliness is not abandonment, but threshold. The person watching is told, not directly, but through symbol and atmosphere, that they are not broken. They are being carved open by the very process meant to set them free. Jung's idea of individuation is revealed as the heart of this experience, not as a goal, but as an unfolding. The video speaks of masks and shadows, of inherited roles and the terrifying quiet of no longer performing. It shows how most people run from this silence, return to noise, and lose the opportunity to meet their soul. But those who remain, who stay in the silence long enough to hear the whispers of their own psyche, begin to change. The shadow is introduced not as an enemy, but as the forgotten twin. Those who meet it in solitude find parts of themselves they had denied for years. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but it's real. The pain of solitude is reframed as the fire of purification. The narrator's tone never shifts into therapy. It remains ceremonial, a kind of mythic voice helping the viewer walk through an internal rite of passage. By the end, the viewer is not given advice. They are left with an image, alone in silence, face to face with the self. There is no conclusion, no resolution, no neat ending. The silence remains, but it has changed. It no longer feels empty. It feels alive. And in that stillness, the final truth emerges, not shouted but intuited. You were never forgotten. You were being prepared. This is not a lesson. It is a remembering. The tone is reverent, the style poetic but grounded, the pacing deliberate, the emotion raw but sacred. It does not ask the viewer to fix anything. It simply asks them to stay in the silence, because somewhere in it, you are waiting for yourself. What if the first thing you wore wasn't a blanket but a mask? Before you spoke your name, before anyone knew what you would become, the world was already whispering who you should be. Through tone, through gaze, through the quiet choreography of expectation, a script was handed to you, not with force but with the invisible power of belonging. And you, barely breathing, began to act. We like to believe that we are free, that we shape our identities like clay, molding who we are by the choices we make. But Carl Jung, watching the soul move behind its social performance, saw something else. He saw that long before we choose, we are chosen. Not in essence, but in form. A mask is offered, and it fits so well we mistake it for our skin. He called it the persona. Not a deception, not a lie, but a necessary veil. The part of you that learns to smile when it's afraid. The part of you that nods when it disagrees. The face you learn to wear to be accepted, to be safe, to be loved. It is not your enemy. It helped you survive, but it is not your whole self. Jung believed that even your birth month, the moment you arrived into the choreography of time, whispers into the persona. January births might summon the silent strength of the elder, while July carries the nurturing mask of the protector. Each season, each psychological weather pattern offers a different fabric from which your persona is cut. The world says, you are born now, therefore you must be this. So we play the part, but the mask is never weightless. As we grow, it tightens. At first it protects, then it defines, and eventually it confines. The truth is, we begin to forget where the mask ends and the self begins. Have you ever felt like you're playing a role even in your most honest moments? That even when you're being yourself, something is missing? A hollowness in the smile, a delay in the heart's voice. That's not dysfunction. That's memory, the soul remembering its shape before the script. Because behind every persona, Jung said, is a shadow, not evil, not wrong, but exiled. The parts of you that didn't fit the mask, the hungers, the rage, the grief. The voice that said no when the world only allowed yes. And that shadow, that strange wind beneath the face you show, is still breathing, still waiting. It doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it lingers in dreams, in triggers. In the moments you can't explain why you're suddenly someone you didn't mean to be. The shadow is not a monster. It is the memory of wholeness, the parts of you you had to hide to be loved. And here lies the quiet betrayal. Most of us confuse the persona for personality. We polish it, we market it, we curate it like a museum of likability, and we call it me. But if you strip away the pleasing, the proving, the performing, who is left? It is not easy to find out. Jung did not promise comfort, he offered confrontation. He said that until you recognize the mask, you will wear it even in solitude. You will love through it, hurt through it, live through it, and wonder why you still feel unknown. So the question must be asked, and not gently, is this life you're living truly yours? Or is it a costume stitched together by silence and survival? And if it's the latter, are you ready to take it off? Not all at once, but slowly, sacredly, one thread at a time, because beneath the mask, the one you were born into, is not shame. It is the face that was waiting to be remembered. And it's looking back at you, even now, through the cracks. Will you look back? Not everyone is ready to return to the place where it all began. Not because the memory is painful, most of us don't even remember our birth, but because something else remembers. Something beneath memory, the psyche. There is a silence in every soul, a pocket of darkness where something was left behind the moment we entered the world. A forgetting, a rupture, not from love but from the completeness we once embodied. Birth is not just the beginning of life. For the soul, it is the first cut, the separation from the all, and with it, the first whisper of shadow. Carl Jung, ever the cartographer of the unconscious, did not speak of the shadow as an abstract darkness. He spoke of it as something intimate, something personal. The shadow is not what haunts you, it's what you've abandoned. The desires that made others uncomfortable. The truths too raw to name. The wildness your family couldn't hold. The archetype your culture wouldn't allow. And so we buried them. And we learned to call the burial maturity. But what if the exile began earlier than we think? What if it began the moment we were born, in a certain season, into a certain structure, beneath a certain set of silent rules? What if the month of your birth did not just offer you a mask, but also defined what part of you would not be welcome? To be born in the cold, in the stern quiet of January, might mean inheriting a legacy of silence, stoicism, emotional withholding. To be born in the bursting fire of July might mean being praised only when you shine, only when you're warm, only when you're generous. And what happens to the parts of you that do not fit that seasonal myth? They become shadow. The shadow behind your birth is not a singular trauma. It is a pattern. It is the grief your mother couldn't name when she held you. It is the unspoken expectations in your father's eyes. It is the collective voice of a culture that assigned meaning to your arrival before you had a voice to speak. And you, small, absorbing, sacred, began to shape yourself to survive. You learned what was safe to express, and what must be hidden. That hidden part, that is your shadow, but not in the way people think. This is not evil. It is not shameful. It is not a demon waiting to be slain. It is a self unlived, unspoken waiting. Not behind you, but within. Jung knew that shadow doesn't just arrive in adulthood. It forms with the first mirror. And sometimes the mirror is the month. The energy you were born under carries a tone, a psychic melody. If you weren't allowed to dance to it, you broke rhythm not in your body, but in your being. And so, a split occurred. One part of you became visible. The rest, silent, watching, became shadow. Have you ever felt that strange, aching sense that parts of you never had a chance to be born? That while your body arrived, something else stayed behind. That's not imagination. That's memory. The soul remembers. And in the deepest corners of your silence, it still speaks. Through dreams, through envy, through irrational rage, through the longing that won't leave even when everything else is good. These are not signs of brokenness. They are the echo of your own self calling you back. To face the shadow is to return not to pain but to possibility. To look at what was hidden and say, I see you, I'm ready. But make no mistake, this is not a journey of light. It is a descent. Jung called this the negrito, the blackening, the stage before transformation, the willingness to walk into the underworld of your own psyche without turning away. And what you may find there quietly, patiently, is not a monster. It is the you who never got to be. And maybe, just maybe, that you was waiting at the threshold of your birth, and is still waiting now. Once you've peeled away the mask and stepped through the valley of shadow, something unexpected happens. The silence no longer terrifies you. The emptiness begins to feel like space. The fragments, all those disowned pieces of you, begin to gather, like constellations once scattered, now forming a shape. And in that shape, you don't see a future self. You see an old self. Not the one shaped by school books or family expectations, but the one shaped by something older, something mythic. This is the beginning of individuation, not the journey of becoming someone new, but the remembering of someone ancient within you. Carl Jung never promised that this journey would bring happiness. He said it would bring wholeness, and wholeness often comes dressed in paradox. You become yourself by unbecoming what the world made you. You find your name by burning the one they gave you. And as you walk this inward path, the month of your birth is no longer just a memory, it becomes a mirror. Each month, in this mythic language of time, is not just a date. It is an archetype, a symbolic deity you were born beneath. Not a god to worship, but a spirit to awaken. In this view, your birth month is a chapter in a myth, not the kind found in books, but the kind buried in blood, in dream, in destiny. To be born in January is to carry the cloak of the sage, the old soul who speaks less but sees more. You came into a world frozen still, where time moves slower and silence is holy. Your myth is not to conquer but to remember, to bring clarity in the cold, to lead from behind the veil. February births whisper of the oracle, the one who hears what others deny. You live in the liminal, between ice and thaw, between what was and what wants to be. Your gift is insight, but your burden is invisibility. You are meant to speak truths that have no language yet. March belongs to the reborn. You arrived as the snow melted, as earth remembered life. You are caught between mourning and miracle. Your myth is resurrection. You've died before, though no one noticed. And still you rise. April calls forth the igniter, fire in human form. You don't ask for permission, you act. But you burn not for glory, but for truth. You are here to start something. But the myth you must rewrite is this. Not every flame must become a forest fire. Sometimes it only needs to warm the forgotten. May gives birth to the lover not in romance, but in presence. You know how to cherish, how to root. But the myth asks more. Not just to love the beautiful, but to find beauty in what breaks. To stay not out of comfort, but devotion. June holds the mirror, born in full bloom. You reflect the world effortlessly. But your mirror must turn inward. You are not only what others see in you. You are the reflection no one has dared to meet. Find that and you find your myth. July brings the guardian. Your heart is a tide, deep and protective. You remember things others forget. Your myth is to shelter but not suffocate, to feel without drowning, to carry memory as medicine, not as weight. August anoints the sovereign, born under the lion's gaze you shine. But your myth is not dominance, it is discernment. Not every light must lead. You must ask, what kingdom are you serving and who suffers in its shadow? September carries the alchemist, born as summer surrenders to stillness. You search for essence, for the real beneath the ritual. Your myth is refinement, not perfection. Let go of the myth that you must be flawless to be whole. You are meant to transform, not transcend. October summons the balancer, harmony runs through you like blood. But the myth you must rewrite is this: peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of truth. You are not here to please, you are here to choose. November, the alchemist of endings. You were born beneath falling leaves when the world begins to let go. Your myth is transformation. You don't fear death, not literal, but symbolic. You are the one who walks others through their undoing, but who walks with you. Let that be part of your rewriting. December sings of the keeper of cycles. Your birth closes the book, but begins the next. You are both memory and prophecy. Your myth is not to finish the story, but to remind the world that stories are how we survive the silence. These are not definitions. These are invitations. Archetypes are not cages, they are keys. They don't tell you who you are, they awaken what already lives in you, waiting. Jung never asked you to believe, he asked you to see. To look again at the timing of your entrance, the symbols you've carried unknowingly, the myth that chose you before you had language. You are not here to obey that myth. You are here to rewrite it. Not to escape your birth, but to re-enter it, this time as the author. There is no conclusion here, no last word, only the sound of something deeper, something older coming to rest. You are not being asked to believe. You are not being told what it means. The months have spoken in symbols. The archetypes have whispered. The mirror has done its work. And now there is only silence, but not the silence of emptiness, the silence of return. Imagine yourself in a room, not a dream, not a metaphor, a room. The walls are aged, worn with time. There are no windows. You don't remember how you entered. You only know you've been here before. And as you turn slowly, feeling the weight of something you've carried but never named, you see it. A crack. A slender, near-invisible fracture in the wall. You wouldn't have noticed it before. But now, light is seeping through. And somehow, without reason, you know, that light began the moment you were born, not from outside, but from within the wall itself, as if time had split just slightly to leave behind a trace, a mark, a sign that you were always meant to return here, to this point, to this breath. You were never lost. You were simply circling back, to the stillness behind the persona, to the shadow that waited patiently, to the myth that was never about destiny but about choice, and now to the silence that contains all your names. Do not rush to close the book. Let the light stay. Let the crack remain. There is nothing to fix, nothing to change, only something to see. And perhaps that's all this was ever about. Not explanation, not definition, just a quiet reminder that even time remembers you. That your birth, in its strange symbolic hour, was not an accident. It was the beginning of a silence etched in light.